Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Humphrey Sipala. I teach at Kabarak University School of Law, and I am editor-in-chief of Kabarak University Press. We are excited and honored to be hosting this webinar. This is the first of 4 webinars that we plan to host to give us a platform to reflect on what the Berlin Conference was 140 years ago and what are its legacies and continuities. We have an excellent panel to start us off today. Our moderator is Chepkori Sambu, to whom I will hand over shortly. But I just thought, as I am opening, I would like to say a couple of words on Kabarak University Press and why we are excited to be hosting this series of conversations, bringing together African intellectuals to discuss the Berlin Conference 140 years later. Kabarak University Press is an academic publisher, the academic publisher of Kabarak University. We are in Kenya, about 160 kilometers east of Nairobi. We believe firmly like that an African, Afrocentric academic publisher should not just sit and wait for the scripts to come. We need to also be part of creating the conversations that bring the scholarship and the thinking and create spaces for African intelligentsia to discuss our concerns and our thinking, and then later on, obviously, be happy to publish thoughts like those. And this is precisely this kind of conversation. For one in the academy, the Berlin Conference is not just a time when empire came together to divide and delimit geographies. More than that, they divided our ontologies and epistemologies. They found a way to describe and categorize how they thought of us in ways that we continue to do. And so the Berlin Conference continues to live in the way we think and the way in our being and we understand ourselves. And so any African thought, any African scholarship should confront these kinds of continuities. We were joking just before we started with the panelists who were just about to be introduced, that someone mentioned that the conference was really about Leopold, so maybe it should have been called the Leopold Conference. And so, but then the Berlin name is kind of bizarre term to still call it. And if we are 140 years later rethinking it, it's probably fitting that it is happening in Nairobi, Lagos, Yaoundé, Medford, and I think it will happen over the next webinars in a few other capitals, that the objects of empire have now turned over and said, wait, we will think for ourselves and we will do it from wherever we are, where empire took us. And so it's a pleasure to be here. Chef Korir, please take us on.
Thank you, Humphrey, for starting us off. I think the audience is having a problem seeing all the panelists, so maybe we can pin the everyone here so that they can see them. But well, welcome to this first webinar in our series of discussions on the legacies of the Berlin Conference. This webinar is done in partnership with African Arguments and TAP Initiative. African Arguments has been curating and publishing publishing articles on this topic. The first one was published last November, titled a robbery on so large a scale, 140 years since the Berlin Conference. So please, if you can go and look at that article together with the next articles that they will be publishing in February this coming month. My name is Chep Korir. I will be moderating this discussion. Throughout this discussion, please feel free to use the Q&A chat Q&A function to ask your questions. And when we get to the question and answer session, if you would like to speak, you can also request the mic. So today we are joined by 3 speakers, one of them who will be joining us in a few minutes. First is Agnes Ebo, who is an international law practitioner specializing in marine affairs, ocean governance, human rights, and open governance. We're also joined by Patrick Gadara, who is the senior editor for inclusive storytelling at the New Humanitarian. He's also a cartoonist, writer, and columnist who regularly discusses and writes on regional and international affairs and decolonization. Our third panelist who will join us shortly is Chidi Ansa Modinkalu, who is a professor of practice in international human rights law at the Fletcher School and currently chairs the Truth, Justice, and Peace Commission, which is a transitional justice initiative to establish the crisis of violence in eastern Nigeria, southeast Nigeria. The purpose of this webinar is to broadly reflect on the Berlin Conference and unpack its legacies. But secondly, it's to mainstream this conversation and set the stage for more such discussions that will explore crucial and specific related issues, such as reparations and transitional justice. And then thirdly, we hope that these conversations can better shape education, as well as broader national and continental policies grounded in the right historical context. That said, we shall now begin. Thank you for joining us, Gadara. It's good to have you here. You have written before, and you have actually been adamant about writing on the Berlin Conference. And I thought that you would be the best person to explain to us the history of the Berlin Conference. Why did it happen? What was the goal? What triggered it?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. What triggered the Berlin Conference? I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the conference is that the conference was much more about Europe than it was about us. By that I mean the conference was set up. It had several goals, some of which were articulated, others are weren't. One of the unarticulated ones was, you remember, it's happening at a time when Germany has just come together as a nation. It's trying to establish itself as sort of a major power within Europe. And at the time, the prestige of many nations was really tied to their ownership of colonies. And Germany was lacking at that point in colonial possessions. So when Bismarck was calling this conference in the 1880s, it was to essentially establish Germany within Europe as a major power, and also to sort of set up the rules for it to acquire colonies in this empty space, at least as they thought of Africa in this area of competition that was going to happen. The second thing was they were trying to avoid wars. In essence, the competition for colonies within Africa, which had already started. Everybody lots of people think the conference is what set up the scramble and partition of Africa. The fact is, it did neither. It did not start the scramble. The scramble was already underway. What they were trying to do was to set up rules for how European countries acquired colonies within Africa, without setting off a general war between themselves. It also didn't partition Africa. There wasn't. A lot of the sort of imagination or imaginary that we have about the conference is this, and you'll see it a lot in the sort of the drawings portraying the conference, is this idea of a bunch of white men seated around a table, around a map, sort of drawing out lines, drawing out countries. That actually didn't happen. They didn't actually create any countries at the Berlin Conference. As I said, they set out the rules for what became the doctrine of effective occupation. How do you actually come to claim a piece of land as your own? What did you have to demonstrate in order to show that this was yours? So, for example, you had to notify everybody that, yes, this is my protectorate, or whatever. You had to demonstrate that you are able to effectively maintain it. So military occupation came out of this idea of effective occupation. This, that they had to show that they could enforce their rules and stuff on these colonies. So these rules are what came out of there and what set the stage then for, I think, what we could say it's an enhanced a process of acquisition of colonies. So before the conference, 80% of Africa was still under African rule. But between that and the next, like, sort of 20, 30 years, all that had been erased. Essentially, the nations that we know today had been parceled out and created. And the process of colonization had sort of essentially got a big, or got supercharged, by the conference. The conference itself actually did set up several things that continue till today. The idea that Africa did not belong to Africans. That it was a stage where other people could come and compete on. And you see it till today, that idea continues. So you always hear Africa as this place where the Chinese and the Americans are competing for influence. Nobody talks of Europe about like this, or talks about, other spaces, are we? That this is the place where anybody can come and claim, and say, we can do. What the Africans want, is sort of kind of secondary to this. The second thing is that our resources are resources that belong not to us, but to essentially the world in general, to other places. So they could sit in a conference where they invited no African, where in fact the Sultan of Zanzibar tried to get in, and was essentially frozen out. So they sat and they debated amongst themselves about the resources of other people. You can see this repeated after at the end of the Second World War. When they were sitting down, they had this idea of something called Eurafrica, which was essentially using an entity that would be using the resources of Africa to rebuild Europe. In fact, the treaty that set up the EEC, which became the EU, the 1957 Rome Treaty, essentially amongst themselves, the European nations partitioned or declared a free trading zone in the area of 21 African countries without consulting any African. So they assumed that our things were theirs, stuff. And you see that sort of idea continuing. Today, Africa is a net donor to the rest of the world. If you are to look at what we get compared to what we give out, it's essentially we subsidize everybody else, and we are not expected to be the ones gaining from the things that we have. So it did set up those sorts of continuities that we see till today. When you look at the countries that eventually got set up, got established, through the process that was created at the Berlin Conference, many of them continue in the very same shape today. And more importantly, the colonial governance, the extractive governance continues till today. So lots of our states are not states that cater to the welfare of their people. They were built to extract, and they continue the logic of extraction, till today. They have police forces that are much more interested in protecting governments from people rather than protecting the people. They have militaries that will fight to the death to protect colonial borders, the idea of sovereignty, but have no qualms about, turning on against their own people and killing the people within those borders, So these are some of the real and continuing contradictions that were there. One final one that I'll mention is even our idea of ethnicity, of how our societies were built. Prior to colonization, identity was very fluid. With colonization, it became this idea of tribe, which we were actually given, that is a totalizing identity. If you're Kikuyu, you are nothing else. That's all you are, and it becomes a thing that describes and defines you in every sector of your life. It's the number one thing. That was alien to us, was never there. And we took it and we have continued with the logic, with that same logic. So it's really important, I think, when we think about Berlin Conference to understand it's not just a conference that happened 140 years ago and it's good to know about it. It's really important to remember that it set up the stage for the sort of Africa we have today, the sorts of lives we are living today, and the sorts of political and economic issues that we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing that very extensive background. Welcome, Professor Chidi. We have just started, and Gadara was giving us the history behind the Berlin Conference and what happened at the conference, as well as some of the legacies of the conference. And Gadara talked about resources, it being a matter of also dividing African resources. And here I would like to bring in Agnes to enlighten us on what resources such as water bodies, rivers, and oceans had, what significance these water bodies had at the conference. Why were they important? What happened during and after the conference in relations to these water bodies? I think you're muted. Yes, you're muted.
Sorry. Hello everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor actually to be talking about these issues. And I think I thank you, Chef Korea and Chidi, for actually pushing us to reflect on some of the issues we work on from that historical perspective. I think the one thing that personally I always say is that we really need to continue teaching history or restart teaching history, because I think we have lost in most of our curricula in our countries the teaching of history and of history from our own perspective, and maybe that's why we have this continuity of the legacies of the Berlin Conference, as Gatara was mentioning just now. In terms of water bodies or water spaces, like I like to refer to them. Well, the Berlin Conference really, I think, is ingrained on water issues. The central part of King Leopold, who was the principal actors, at least that we remember, and that whom we taught about regarding the conference, was access to the Congo River and the navigation of rights to navigation in the Congo River. And the Niger River, but the access to to the continent itself by Europeans and the United States, which was one of the members, was through coastal kingdoms. I think we really need to remember that initially the access wasn't inland. The coastal kingdoms were used, including particularly the Benin area, were used to because Europeans could not immediately access the inland areas and rivers, so they went through the coastal kingdoms to achieve that, and the kingdoms then, or the runners of the kingdoms were then the medium that were used to enslave, basically access the more lacustrine, they say in English, areas. So the water bodies are central to that, because also in terms of resources, basically the important resources and the navigation was about how to navigate within the Congo River, and then go through the rainforests and the Rift Valley, savannas, and then the Great Lakes to the Zambezi, and finally to the Indian Ocean. So really, I think this was the principal objective of King Leopold, to establish trade relationships with local nations. But of course, as we know, it was under the disguise of humanitarian action or mission. And so I think this, and at the time, Portugal was one of the actors who was actually accessing territories from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And we would remember that it was then that Great Britain, worried about its own corridor, then intervened, and which was how some of the actors actually joined the conference, and that's how the sharing happened. So I think, yes, that's what I can say about the involvement or the role of navigable areas in the Berlin Conference.
Thank you. And the rivers ended up being discovered by Europeans, and they ended up getting European names, and they gave access to the interior parts of Africa, really facilitating what was called effective occupation. And I was wondering whether at this point, Professor Chidi can chime in.
Well, thanks a lot, and good day, colleagues, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining this. It's history has been pretty much eviscerated from curriculums across the country, across the continent, really. And the version of history that we get told is a version that is Victor's history, in quotes, that really does no credit to parts of the world. And it's tremendous to be able to use the facilities of the digital world to be able to at least begin to disinter our own narratives in a way that connects with the horizons of younger people. Because at the end of the day, we've got to have people who succeed us on the African space and African continent and African identity. And it's interesting, Chep Korea, that you should say this. And I'm really grateful I'm coming in after Patrick and Agnes as well. At least I listened to a significant part of what Patrick said. And I'm totally privileged to have listened to both of them. Now, it's interesting that you make this point about how our water bodies were discovered and indeed how we were discovered. because that is at the heart of this thing, right? Now, of course, the discoverers then become the people who define us. And continue from where Agnes stopped, if you go back to the final act of Berlin, you'll see that the main objective, the declared objective of the meeting, actually, the Berlin Conference, was to assure to all nations the advantages of free navigation on the two chief rivers of Africa flowing into the Atlantic Ocean. This is explicit. To assure to all nations, except to Africans, the advantages of free navigation of African rivers discovered by Europeans. So, who discovered Victoria Falls? Livingstone. And where was Livingstone from? He came from Zambia, didn't he? Or Zimbabwe. And who discovered River Niger? Oh, who discovered the source of the Congo? De Brazza. And what do? We even give him an entire city called Brazzaville. Right? And we name a lot of hotels after him. And the people who lived in those places no longer exist in the imagination of the world. Bugolobi was discovered by another white person. And we teach this to our children. But what is the point, really? Two things. One was the evisceration of our identities and the substitution, therefore, with the point that Patrick made, which is ethnicization and therefore ethnocentrism. And Mamdani makes that point also from the discovery of African rivers to the discovery of African ethnicities, and therefore the socialization and programming of Africans into these ethnicities. The other really is the stealing of African water spaces, and that continues till date. It's not so effective occupation, as Agnes said, was a mechanism of working our way through water bodies to the stealing of interior spaces of the interior hinterlands of Africa. That was one. But even worse than that, our water bodies were stolen. You know, when I went to primary school, we're told, if you look at the major rivers of Africa, Nile, Niger, Congo, Zambezi, and all of the rest of them, these were the water bodies, these were the entities that defined effective occupation. So they went after the water bodies, and then around them, traded territory. So take the Gambia, okay? The Gambia, I mean, the Brits traded the little piece of territory around the River Gambia. And how did they do that? They took it in order to give Portugal what they have now as Bissau. They wanted just the river basin. And they wanted to assure themselves navigability from the inland for primary produce to the coastline. And around that, they built their extractive, the point Patrick makes about extraction. This is central, the externalization of our water bodies, which continues till date, is central to the entire project of colonial occupation. And it links the colonial occupation in intertemporal terms to slavery, because it was the same thing that happened. If you need to be able to connect that thread to be able to understand how is it that the Congo has this aperture in Kinshasa from where it begins in Goma, all right? The only way you understand that is the continuities in time from slavery to effective occupation in Berlin. And you know, a lot of people don't teach this. I think the only person, the African historian who has done perhaps the greatest piece of work in this area is the late Edu Bohen, you know, Professor Edu Bohen from Ghana. And he is the person who helps us to connect those continuities. And the continuities to this time, I think Patrick has really captured. I'm not going to venture into that territory. And he's done it consistently in his writing. Actually, if anybody wants to get properly educated about Berlin, just search for Patrick Gathara, Berlin Conference, and you can start reading him from whenever you want. So I'll yield here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I cross to the next segment, which is now discussing the colonial project after Berlin, I actually, let's get into that. But I want to ask Agnes, why was the DRC so important at the Berlin conference? And then we get into the colonial project, where I would want to start with Patrick to explain to us the whole creation of borders and what that process entailed. Was there violence involved in the creation of borders and effective occupation? So let's start with Agnes. You're muted, sorry.
Yeah, so thank you. Well, as I said, one of the major terms of the agreement was, among them was the recognition of King Leopold's Congo claim. So and so that's why, and then free trade in the two basins, the Congo basins and the Congo basin and river basin, and like Chidi underlined, the freedom of navigation in the two rivers, the Congo and the Niger River. The Berlin Conference had set what they called the free seas, which initially King Leopold, who played a very central role in the conference and its outcomes, had initially sent representatives to map out, basically in the Congo basin, to map out the routes and establish the trading relationships that the colonizers were going to have with the local nations to then access. And so they called them the three C's. The three objectives were commerce, civilization, and Christianity. So really, trade is very central to the Berlin Conference, and as Chidi reminded us, the objective was really to and Gafara to share the resources rather than fighting among themselves. So, and in order to do that, the navigation was very, very key. And the Congo River, as you know, because when you look at the circuit of the Congo River, it basically, like I said in my introduction, it's really the river that connects you to the different places from both the almost Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. So, and then you can go through the equatorial forest or rainforest of Central Africa, the Rift Valley, and the entire Great Lakes and Zambezi, then land on into the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why the Congo River, which is the heart of the Congo Basin, really played a central role in the conference and in its outcomes. It was an objective from the start, and of course in the outcomes it became one of the major realization of the conference, which then each state could at least have a significant piece of what we then call the scramble.
Thank you. I'd like to remind the audience to use the Q&A for any questions, and we'll get to the question and answer session. But Gadara, you talked about partition having happened really before the Berlin Conference. And thanks to the Berlin Conference, we ended up, I'd want you to talk about that process of partition and border and colonialism.
Yeah, what I said was a scramble for Africa. The race to acquire, if you will, blocks of the continent was already underway, and was really supercharged by the conferences. Both Agnes and Chidi have mentioned. And I think that, obviously the whole process of colonization was a violent one. There's nowhere where Africans willingly ceded their territory to other people, or to a colonial power. And in fact, the sort of the fiction of how people traded away their land for trinkets, that, they sat and they signed away documents and agreed to be protectorates, etc. A lot of this was really fiction, and the Europeans knew it was fiction. It was something that they were utilizing amongst themselves to legitimize the taking away of territories from Africans. It's really important to keep in mind that even at Berlin, they were clear, and Bismarck made this clear, and it was open, that they had not met to discuss whether or not Africans had sovereignty. That was not part of the discussion, and they quite openly sort of rejected the idea that we had sovereignty over our own possessions. So therefore, when they came to take them, they weren't taking something that belonged to somebody else. And that's how they legitimized it. And one could argue that this idea of discovery and then possession predated Berlin, which it did. The doctrine of discovery was something that, if you look from the 15th, 16th century, when they went to America, the idea that they could just go and grab. These were debates that they already had before, and essentially had positioned themselves as almost heirs of the globe, that they could go wherever they wanted and take whatever they did, and it was legitimate, and more importantly, it was moral, for them to do so. So anyway, following Berlin, you've got this sort of move into the interior of the continent, where before you had trading relationships, because if you think about the areas around the coast that Agnes had mentioned, lots of them had trading relationships with Europe for ages. They were recognized as kingdoms in their own right. They weren't vassals of Europe or protectorates of Europe. But following this, lots of them now became taken out, became conquered, it became legitimate to overtake them, to essentially to go around and call them as part of our sphere of influence, something that we own, and then being converted to colonies. So take the example of Kenya, which by the time of the conference, you already had relations between the Sultan of Zanzibar and the Omani-owned coast, with both the Portuguese before and the British later on. It was only afterwards that they started moving in, declaring. So after Berlin Conference, you've got the creation of what became the East African Protectorate initially, And it wasn't until actually in about 1920 that Kenya declared a colony, by itself. But there was this idea of being a protectorate, being something where they could, a space where they could exercise occupation. And so you've got, from the Somali coast down the Kenyan coast, some ways inland, towards Uganda, etc. All that, the British essentially claimed as their own, as a protectorate. It's not like we had a choice not to be protected by them. They just come in and they say, and then eventually it was declared as a colony, with borders that were drawn. Again, borders were quite fungible. If you remember, in the 70s when Kenya was arguing with Uganda about, where the border should be, whether it should come up till Nakuru or Naivasha, or it should be where it is at the moment. There's been questions about Kenya's border in Somalia. Should it be all the way up to Kismayu, or down? All these I find to be quite strange arguments that we are having, about, but were all predicated on this idea that, they came in and then they drew the borders that we then went on to accept. Finally, I would say, think about in 1963, when the OAU first met, one of the big questions that was on the table was, what do we do with colonial borders? Do we get rid of them? So a lot of us understood, a lot of the people at that table understood, yes, these were manufactured, but they came to the conclusion, which I think in retrospect perhaps may not have been the most intelligent thing to do, that we had to accept them or risk quote-unquote instability and wars over this, over where spaces, where lines would be drawn. I think that the decision to accept colonial borders went with it the decision to accept colonial ways of governance, that were predicated on those borders, or that were the result of the creation of those borders. And the colonial states that had been set up continued essentially as they were set up for most of for most of Africa, and I think that even today, when we start thinking of decolonization and we start thinking about how do we reimagine Africa, we should say that the borders are things that we need to talk about. Why is it that Africa is the one continent around the world that is the most difficult to move around? For a Kenyan to go to Nigeria, to go whatever, it's easier for me to go to Europe than it is to get a flight to to Congo, to Sudan, somewhere somewhere near. Why is it that we continue to have this balkanization of the continent? If you think about East Africa, the East African community, which is an interesting example, where we've got a common market and a customs union in name, but you still need a work permit. We still have borders where you still need a passport. In fact, I think we're the only region that created a passport that is only accepted within that region. And it is a region that should not have borders anyway. So there's something called an East African passport that if you get, is only, you can only use it within East Africa, but East Africa should have no borders. Of the customs union market, a common market, So these things exist only in name. They don't exist in reality, and you have to ask why. Why is it so hard for us to come together? And I think a lot of it is still the legacies of the ideas that were born out of the Berlin Conference and out of colonization that continue till today. Sorry, I tend to ramble a bit. I hope that made some sense.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll come back to you later and to all of you, especially on the word protectorate and the fact that there was a humanitarian angle to the Berlin Conference. Chidi, I wonder whether along that line you can continue narrating to us the nature of the subsequent colonialism, as well as the challenges then that countries faced at independence.
Well, maybe we've got to track back in order to move forward, and thanks for that. 2 or 3 things. Conceptually, of course, the declared mission of the occupation project were mutually incompatible. Okay? Commerce, Christianity, and civilization were mutually conceptually incompatible. For those who, of course, believe in Christianity, whether you're talking about the love of money is the root of evil, or what Jesus Christ did to the folks who were using his father's house to make money. The fact is, Christianity did not quite sit well with commerce as a proposition, theologically. And the civilization project, the only part of the so-called civilization project that owed to Christianity was the denigration of the Black race. The use of theology to put Blacks beneath humanity. And all of that was at the heart of the notion of discovery of Africans. And that then rose from theology to jurisprudence. So when you read Southern Rhodesia, and I will encourage everyone, whether or not you are a lawyer, as long as you are African, and for those who teach, whatever you teach, even if you teach physics, or even if you teach nuclear physics, every African must read Southern Rhodesia. When you finish reading it, pause and look at yourself again. This was a case decided by the Privy Council, which was the highest court in England for for the colonies, in June 1818, as the First World War was just about to end. Although it is reported in 1919, it was actually decided in June 1918. And it said that essentially you cannot understand the crisis that happened with Mugabe and acquisition and land redistribution in Zimbabwe without reading Southern Rhodesia. That was where the principle that we were discoverable, terra nullius, was written into law. And how did they justify it? That as a matter of law, we were so low in the scheme of civilization, of humanity, that our norms could not be reckoned with amongst civilized peoples. We did not exist. Everything about us, our norms, our traditions, our institutions, our memories, everything got wiped out by Lord Sumner in his lead opinion in that case. Every African must read it. If there is nothing you take away from this today, please go, and it's available online. I can share the link before you leave. The citation is 1919 Appeal Cases, page 212. I have crammed the pages because you really need to. Now, as this thing migrated from theology to jurisprudence, it then became something for countries to enforce. Now, and this idea that Africans did not exist was at the heart of the colonial liquidation that occurred. What people don't talk about is that effective occupation was accompanied by the deliberate, Patrick talks about the violence of colonialism. I don't think people have computed it. The DRC was decimated in a period of about 24, 25 years by about 60%. Its people got liquidated. The population, and when you look at Africa's population, in that period of establishing effective occupation between 1885 and about 1914, 1918, the world was growing in population because of discoveries in medicine, advances in all of that. The one place where everything, populations were falling, were crashing, demographics, was Africa. And of course, in the 19th century, two major empires had collapsed. One was actually two and a half, if you think about it. One was the Spanish Empire in the Americas, okay? And so you had the independence of Latin American countries. The half was the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Brazil in 1822. And the other empire that collapsed, of course, was the Mughal Empire in India, with the transition from Company Raj to British Raj in 1858. What then transpired was the only place left for Europe and the rest of the world to establish, to advance their extractive designs was Africa. And that was what drove a lot of the stuff. Now, and that violence, and I think Patrick also made the point in his chapeau, that violence has not stopped. It is what's programmed. It was programmed into, a lot of people talk conspiracy theories. I actually think programming is a better explanation than conspiracy. That was actually programmed into, you see, when parents get children, they try to teach children habits. And by the time you are 15, 16, your habits are configured, your neural wirings are set. It is the same thing. By the time you run a country a territory for over 100 years, and you're bequeathing to them institutions, you have already set the wiring, you've programmed them. There is no conspiracy to this. It is programming. And the deprogramming is what we did not undertake, partly because the capacity to deprogram was taken away. The sovereign capacity, the sovereign front lobe was lobotomized by the process of colonial occupation. And I do not think that we have interrogated also the social psychology of colonialism as much as we could in a society like, say, the DRC, or in a society like Zimbabwe, or indeed tropical Africa, or in fact, you take any parts of the continent. And I do think we have a duty to do so. And so that when young people today tell you, oh, you know what, we need the Brits and the French to come and reoccupy us again. They did not experience it, and they did not see their grandparents experience it, so they don't know what they're talking about. And for those, actually, who are interested, and some of these books, actually, I think we should try and acquire the rights to, so that we can begin to find ways to make them available. But somebody should actually make available Professor Hubert Deschamps' book, The French Union. Yes? It is called The French Union, and how he describes what they did will make you weep. And the arrogance with which folks, and hubris with which they tell these stories, as if we were worth nothing. And in fact, we were worth nothing to them, and our ancestors were worth nothing. That arrogance we need to begin to address in our respective areas. But I'd actually, as I said, challenge every one of us here. Go back and try and read Southern Rhodesia, because it's always useful to understand where the rain started beating us. I yield.
Thank you so much. I see we have a number of questions, and so I will just conclude this discussion and head to the question and answer session by asking each one of you, and I'll start with Agnes, about what you now see as the continuities of the Berlin Conference. What are the legacies you see? How are they manifested now in Africa?
Wow, that's a vast question, but I'll try to, because I have two great co-panelists who have a very great sense of the broader picture. I will try and just maybe limit my answer to the maritime and marine water bodies sector. I happen to have worked specifically on issues around maritime piracy for the past maybe 10, 15 years. What Chidi's almost conclusion was about how we need to really also learn how where things began and how they are continuing to affecting us today. If you pay attention, we've had all these conflicts, at least for the oldest among us. We've had the cycle of conflict prevention, resolution, or whatever studies for the past maybe 30 years. And the one area that we haven't touched a lot was the water sector. A lot of people went on to studying and addressing fighting conflict or resolving conflicts in the Sahel, in the equatorial areas, and so on, but not on on with respect to water areas. As I think it is in your article that you wrote with Chidi, that you also reminded us of how a lot of the border issues are in most of the border conflict in Africa, but they also most of the time they're maritime borders, because that's also where the resources are. So my take away from this is really that we have neglected our water areas ourselves as Africans, and there is today a sort of new renewed interest and access. So we had this whole piracy issues, which started, at least for Africa, modern day piracy, started with recently with the Gulf of Aden, and moved to the Gulf of Guinea. Then we're now linking, and that here I'm talking actually about programming in international development, moving to now linking the criminality at sea and the criminality in, or terrorism rather, which is actually the words that are being used now, to the Sahel. In parallel to that, and this is mostly done, covered by Europeans, we are not funding, we are not addressing these issues ourselves as African, especially, well, our leaders mostly. You do not find civil society working on those kind of issues. So I think, and we're now talking blue economy, sustainable development of, there's an entire sustainable development goal that is addressed to water, what is it called? Life below water. So I think, again, we are entering an area where, in the disguise of conservation of resources, especially marine resources, someone else is taking the lead in addressing the issues in our water areas, and we are, at least our leaders, we are sitting and watching and waiting for that to happen. And in as much as I do believe, I think that yes, conservation is important, and sustainable use of resources is important. We are not the ones leading that conversation and leading action and programming around these issues. So I think that is very important, because also the resources and the modern resources, mind you, because we're also talking of the deep sea area, which is basically how we exploit and use the resources underneath the seabed, which is really the conversation that is being had now. Africa does not have, there's a whole international seabed headquartered in Jamaica. We are not participating in those conversations. It's again a conversation between, the big powers, howsoever they have shifted slightly. And just to finish, I would also say that really, the whole, we've almost come full circle now, moving just a bit away from just the water areas. Discussions today are around multilateralism, whether it's sustainable or it's dying, competitive international trade or competitive trade between China and the United States and others, which are the lesser powers, but we're still not in the conversation. Genocide. And all these things are the legacies. And more recently, in the past week, we have Congo. We have a strong conversation around AI. There was a conversation this week about the competition between the US and China around AI, but also that it's conversation around the chips and access to the chips, and those chips are from the Congo. So it's almost like a whole full circle of we're back to Berlin. We're back to 1885 or something like that. So I think this is really a way of saying we need to pay attention, and we need to also be very intentional, just like the people who managed to colonize us were intentional in what they were doing. We have to be intentional about how we address these things. And that's why I think, again, I agree with everyone that this isn't just a historical thing that is nice to learn about your history or something. It is really, it is our modern day Africa is very linked to that, and we need to address these issues. Otherwise, we probably will end up with another Berlin. It might happen in Paris or in New York or in Beijing, actually, because the superpower will come from somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Gadara, and then Chidi, and then we'll move to the questions. I know you also wrote about tying the humanitarian crisis currently to Berlin, so it would be helpful to also highlight that.
I think in terms of continuities, I've mentioned quite a few in my comments. I'm not going to go over all that again, but I think we have to also think about our conceptualizations of what Africa is and how those actually a product, a lot of them of colonization, and of the process that was essentially supercharged by the Berlin Conference. The idea that all Africans are the same, that we all share some cultural unity. We are, myself and somebody in Nigeria, somehow share an affinity. There are things that are called African values, and stuff. These are imaginaries that we have created, or that to a large extent have been imposed on us, that we have accepted. And we don't question where they came. Should we accept them? Should we not? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have unity, but I'm saying the basis of that unity has to be something that we create, or something that we understand, rather than just something that we are taught to accept. I also think that the invisibility of Africans, not just in the international realm, where we only exist as an area, as a region, but also within our own discourses, within our own political systems, where we valorize. In one of the questions, there's a question of how our indigenous ideas of sovereignty were different from the Westphalian ideas. The Westphalian is about territory. It's about controlling territory. Our ideas of sovereignty was about people, and what we've been turned into is these societies that can, as I said before, can fight over borders. You know, those imaginary lines, the idea of territory. So we fight over territory we don't even use or want, simply because there's a line drawn there. But we don't think about the people within these territories. We don't value them. And I think this, for me, it manifests in many ways, even in how we talk about refugees, or this idea of the movement of people being seen as problematic, because there are too many of them coming here. Our ideas of sovereignty were about people. We would welcome people because that made you more powerful, that made you a bigger leader in a sense. Not because you controlled more territory, it's because you had people. We've had that turned on its head. And I think we need to again rethink where these ideas, we know where they come from, but just how they have infected our approach to pretty much everything in our political, in our cultural discussions, whether it's things like, when we think about sex and this supposed African fear of of discussing all matters sex, or this idea that, we never had homosexuals, we never did this, we were never sexually adventurous, all these constructions come from Berlin, come from the ideas of what Africa was that were built there, that have been taught to us throughout the ages. So I would say, in addition, this is not just a discussion of a sort of a historical process. It's also a discussion of what we are and how we think, and what we think of ourselves till today, and how that was constructed. And I think if we are actually open to having a proper discussion about that, I think there's a lot that we'll find is freeing of us. That it's a very liberatory understanding to discover as an African can be anything. That you don't have to live up to an idealized idea or notion of what a proper or traditional, quote unquote, African is. And I think for me, I would end by saying, at the end of that journey is a question of whether we should even accept that there is such a thing as Africa, there is such a thing.
Thank you. That's sensitive questions.
If I may just cotton onto that, for this idea of how we're constructed, and colonialism, and particularly in the context of this conversation, I think my background is in law and amateur history, but there are two aspects of this. One is our pedagogy, just basic teaching, because when you talk about programming, that's where it's happened, teaching. I'm sure there are many people here who are graduates of SOAS. SOAS was set up basically to totally invent African anthropology. At the end of that period of colonial occupation, as colony then set off, SOAS was set up 1914, 1915. In the middle of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was about to collapse. They set it up to invent that notion of the subservient, idealized notion of subservient, ethnocentric, ethnicized African they wanted to be. And you had all of these under Professor Malinowski, who in fact came from Poland. They invented a whole discipline of African anthropology. And that is what a lot of our professors were taught, the grand professors, who then taught the people who taught the people who taught us, right? And the nature of the academic discipline is such that when you go to research, you are told to go and read those people. And if you are publishing, you've got to cite them in your footnotes and credit them. So the only thing you can do is agree or disagree with them. And if you disagree with them too much, they ask you, who are you to disagree with them? It's as simple as that. So how do we, and Chepkwere, you and I have had this conversation about how you're Kenyan, I'm Nigerian, and we are told that the British established these fine institutions called judiciary, and they gave us independent judiciaries. And, for generations, African lawyers have been taught that we inherited independent judiciary from the Brits, from colony. How can a colonizer give you independent judiciary? You don't even need to think about it much. And the day after over 25 years having first qualified as a lawyer, I then asked myself this question and discovered I had been lied to. I felt so stupid. More than 25 years after leaving university and first qualifying as a lawyer, I discovered that just by a mental process, asking the question, can colony give you independent judiciary? I actually discovered it was a lie. But you know what happened? All of us have been contaminated with this nonsense. Okay? And across so many countries, we were told these compromised colonial institutions were supposed to have built proper societies for us. And just by failing to undertake that mental process of adjustment, or that process of mental adjustment post-colony, we have done a lot of damage to Africa's young people and to African societies. I could illustrate this with so many other things, but we do not adequately appreciate how dangerous the post-colonial pedagogy has been. And that is why this conversation is actually important. That we need to begin to, and Patrick is asking these questions, and some people will be here thinking these are dangerous questions, but these are necessary questions. Absolutely necessary questions. For Kenyans, the first piece of indigenous anthropology from Kenya, believe it or not, was facing Mount Kenya. You may not agree with what Mzee wrote there, and he was not an anthropologist to begin with. And part of that was the influence of Professor Malinowski, who in fact supervised the project. But that was the first piece of indigenous anthropology from Kenya. It was not by an academic. So how do we create anthropology and you see, they'll tell you, go and read law, go and read medicine, the things that frame us are not those things. It is history, it is anthropology, it is sociology, it is political science. When you want our kids to go read those, they tell you, no, you will not make money. And because they're telling you will not make money, what is happening? You're giving up on the obligation to create a society that works for your people, because your brain and neural wiring has been externalized. So this is why it is important for us to have these conversations, to begin to, in the hope that even if it is one person from this conversation that we can convert, to begin to look at African societies differently and begin to take it rigorously and seriously, it would not have been in vain. Let me yield.
I'm going to let you continue with any thoughts you have, but within the context of also the questions that have been asked, so that we can finish on time or not so much out of time. So someone is asking, African ports, waterways and the networks carefully tracked down in order to facilitate extraction from minerals to our black bodies. Transport this picture into the 21st century, how much has actually changed? The plans, the corridors that are being built as we speak, the cables laid beneath our seas and oceans across lands, what has changed? I think that we'll go to Agnes. And what parallels can be drawn between the partition of Africa and the partition of DRC? As well as, is it not time we have the Berlin conference, we have the Benin conference, a collective of our peoples, reframing and planning in the perspectives of Utu Ubuntu, whichever iteration we wish to call that, which broadly speaking connects our people across the continent. We have nothing to develop, rather much to regenerate. So Gadara, you will take one of those questions as well as, and Chidi, you will take the other. And then also, I think Gadara, you wanted to comment on something before the questions, but just let me interrupt this also and say that I have received news that Bethel Ogot has just passed away, who was an African historian, a Kenyan African historian. And so we would like to honor his legacy and contribution to history as part of this, of today's webinar.
Condolences.
Wow.
Over.
Okay. I didn't know about Professor Ogot. That's so sad to hear. Okay. Well, quick sort of I think response to what Chidi said. Some of the things that it brought to mind, it really sort of, to me, identify some of the things that we talk about or how we talk about things in Kenya. So, for example, in Nairobi, people always pine for something called the Nairobi's golden days, the Nairobi's past glory, and there's this imagination that, oh, in colonial days, Nairobi worked, and they'll be shown all these nice pictures of, clean streets and, well-parked cars and stuff. But Nairobi only worked because they kicked out everybody who was not white.
Yes.
It was not for us. It was not built for us. And there is this imagination that, oh, we were given working systems and we messed them up, which is garbage, is rubbish, and I think we need to recognize that the colonial states were never built for us. They were built to extract. And in fact, that's what they keep doing. They are doing what they were set up to do, And he's very right about the idea of us not thinking about history. It's very deliberate. They don't want us thinking about history because they don't want us questioning why then these things never changed. Masinda Mulire in Parliament, I think in 1967, asked a question. He said, we've got a black man's government, but that government enforces the very same laws that the white man's government has. So what was independence? We are never encouraged to think about those. That's why they don't want us looking at history. They keep telling you learn STEM, and I'm not saying mathematics, science, etc. is not important, but we are being told to devalue understanding ourselves, understanding where we are, and instead understand things, understand people, understand objects. It is the same colonial logic that I said before. It is the same idea that what matters is not the people, is not us. What matters is the land. So understand the land, understand the physics, understand, all of that stuff. And we need to change. We need to subvert that thinking. We need to go back and force it on our people, on our kids, to start thinking about their own places in the wider scheme of things. Where are they? Where do they exist? How do they exist? What are the things that matter? What does history teach them about the things that matter? This idea that all we do is develop, and in fact, the whole logic of development, again, something that was kind of embedded in the discussions of in Berlin, where he said, which is true, that it was clothed, and even Agnes mentioned this, it was clothed in the language of humanitarianism. this idea that they are coming to save us, basically by stealing from us, and that till today is the same. We are not developed. We are backward. We are primitive, and we need to become like them. That whole idea continues till today. We accept it. We say we are underdeveloped. But who defines development? It is, oh, you are underdeveloped because you don't live like somebody in London, or you don't live like somebody in the US. It's still them. You look at Kenya's example. Our president is quite happy to take pictures of himself strolling the streets of New York. In a way, he'd never take pictures of himself walking in Nairobi. Those ideas continue till today, and we need to relearn, unlearn that programming, as Chidi says, and start thinking afresh, anew, looking at us. And we cannot do that without digging, into the history that's there. Sorry, I don't take up too much time, but yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. And yes, and if you can, please, you can also answer some of the questions in the chat by typing, if that's possible. That way we can save time. And yes, there was a question for you.
Yes, well, I do understand where the question would come from about the corridors, but for me, I think yes, it's in a way it's the same process. However, I think that we need to do those things today. We can't move. We're not the movement within the continent is very reduced. Whether it's movement of persons or movement of goods. 80% of trade within the continent, what globally actually happens through water. Today, we have almost zero movement on water within the continent. So if ports and the movement through ports and corridors can facilitate that, for me, I would of course rather that it is done by our governments and our leaders. The African Continental Free Trade Area is not an African-led process. It is something that again originates from mostly the European Union, but I think we need to at some point take advantage of these things. If we don't want the version that is given to us, we have to create our own version. But I really don't understand why it is not possible for me to go to, well, it is, but it's almost it's something that most people don't do, but it is possible for me to go from Cameroon to Nigeria by boat, although it's not the easiest, and it's not the most common way. It's also not, for instance, you can actually, the Congo again, the Congo River is the place where you have the most movement of intra Africa movement. But the Congo today is circulation on the Congo River is a human crisis. It's almost every day. There's a boatload of people that capsizes and people die in there, and you never see that in the news, but it does happen. If you type, if you just Google, boat accident or something around that in the Congo, you would see that every week there is an incident, and you don't hear about that. So I think it's up to us to define how how we build those corridors, and not necessarily reject them as something that is a continuation of colonial making, because people were moving in canoes and makeshift boats before before Berlin. And they were exchanging, when we didn't have borders. So we should be able to continue doing that today, just maybe not in the construct that is imposed to us, or that we actually are waiting, because it's also an internalization of this, the whole Berlin legacy, to be just to wait for someone to come and make and build a corridor and fund it, because that's really truly what it is. The corridors are being funded because the EU wants better access to markets within the continent, and as Humphrey was Patrick was mentioning, it's again, I think aid is really our own way of continuing the humanitarian excuse that was used before is again used today as aid, but we also are the ones who are accepting it, and it is our role today. I think going forward from what Chidi is saying, we do need to understand the history through sociology and anthropology and everything, but we also need to, once we have understood, be more proactive and address these issues for the future generations, and encourage those generations to use those learnings to then redefine our borders and our movements and our identities as Africans. So I wouldn't rule out the corridors, just maybe who is pushing for the corridors it might be the issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will finish in about 5 to 7 minutes. But before then, I've seen a question on the drawing parallels to the DRC. I would like to beg you to hold that for the next webinar, which will be more focused on specific topics, the DRC being one of them for sure. But give the last chance to Femi to ask a question, and then afterwards we can conclude.
Yeah, thank you all. Can you hear me first and foremost? Yeah, thank you. One wonderful discussion, and of course, we've had these discussions over the years in different ways, and they continue because, of course, the subject matter is almost just repetitive. It's a reiteration of this dynamic that has continues. But what a couple of points that I'm making, I will bring to the end question as well, that when we look at this kind of period of time, it's as though it's definitive, and really this is a construct of maybe at best 400 years. And I'm just wondering the extent to it, because Africans, however we wish to define that, and I agree that we need to define that, the idea of groups of peoples that lived within the continent is not an unknown factor to that side, the global north, if you like, that it's been known for centuries and centuries beyond that period of the majesty of what was in the continent. So it's not like this kind of construct over the last 400 years, it's something very, very calculated. And I think we have to, agree that clearly isn't definitive of our histories. And I think you're all saying that anyway. But what also kind of frustrates many of us, and plus we are almost somehow complicit to it, is we continue to use the instruments. And I think, Chidi, you said this, that kind of perpetuate what is actually happening to us. And I think what's happening in the 21st century is that there's the idea of data and the idea of, the kind of technological world, which is also another prism of this colonial project. And the challenge that I'm asking, many of us is there are tools now very much available to us to start building our own platforms. So like this, for example, this conference, which is so important and it's so strategic. And as you said, all of you, we've got to spread this to our peoples, to our youth. But it's been done on Zoom and it's been recorded on Zoom. And we don't know where that server is that has this. We don't know which AI system it's going into that literally chops and breaks down what we're saying and can counteract what we're saying. So we need our spaces as well so that we can also be strategic. I think somebody mentioned about having a Benin conference and, we've got to come together as peoples, but we do that in using the very instruments that are kind of used not just to dismantle us, because that's the thing about these systems. It's not just a question of Black people. It's a question of Black people and exploitation of whoever we can exploit at the very kind of kernel of humanity. And so we are part of that, being such a rich resource. So I'm just saying, can we find spaces that are more independent? They exist. There's many of us, well, not many, but at least a few who are kind of got into that space. And we want our peoples to start using independent, self-hosted systems so that we're not giving away everything and kind of being extracted without us even understanding what's happening. Anyway, I'll leave it there. And it's a kind of question, whether that's, to the extent to which the panel kind of accept that as something that we need to address. And then the next step, how can we actually move on to having these spaces that we can share amongst our communities? And it doesn't have to be centralized. These are federated, independent systems that we can all use. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think, Chidi, I will let you finish off with that question, and then we can conclude.
I think this is also probably related in some form to Mwansa's question about the regional blocks and what to do about them. And maybe if and this is really about the autochthony of our institution building and reconfiguring of the post-colonial arrangements. And for those who want to, if you look at the Colonial Development Act of 1929, adopted at the end of the bullish era of the bull run of the 1920s and the onset just about of the Great Depression, it actually tells you all you need to know. Let me see whether I can pull it up here. Yes, here you go. The development was for the purpose of aiding and developing agriculture and industry in the colonies and territories, and thereby promoting commerce with our industry in the United Kingdom. That wasn't just law, it was also infrastructure. And you got locked into a logic. Now, all of these things were done to develop commerce in the metropolitan, okay? Reconfiguring it is not going to be easy. And if you have a leadership that don't even understand that this is what transpired, you're finished. Again, I go back to law. In every one of our countries, what do we teach our students? The first class you take is Introduction to the Legal System. And in Introduction to Legal System, as a law student, you're taught that the sources of law in an African country, in the common law system, if you're in the civil law system, is the codes, the French codes, right? Which go back to Napoleon. If you are in the common law system, it's common law, doctrines of equity, and statutes of general application in force in England, either on the 1st of January 1900 or the 1st of January 1874. Okay? Those still apply to our countries. That is the laws that were made when Queen Victoria was in charge of the United Kingdom and was the sovereign, and Queen Victoria died in 1901. Those are the ones ruling us. And this is what we teach our students. And we don't even make the effort to tell them, look, this is nonsense. It should not be happening. And if you don't tell the teacher that the laws governing you are the laws made in Queen Victoria, you fail. Okay? So when we are talking about advances in AI and information independence, which is the point that Femi makes, at least that's the one I get. We actually, it's more fundamental than that, because those are consequential issues. Information independence cannot be discussed with people who are teaching their, and of course, you've got to configure this in accordance with law and all of that, who are teaching their students and producing lawyers who believe that the laws that should govern your information independence in 21st century should be laws adopted in the era of Queen Victoria. You see the point. And this takes me to the question about Omwasa, about regional systems. And it's connected with the point that Agnes made. No, we trade a lot with ourselves as Africans. As we speak, ECOWAS has now lost 3 member states, right? And if you believe what you hear, Niger Republic, Burkina Faso, and Mali have gone off. But that is not reality. Why? Because you're not going to end the trade between Niger Republic and Nigeria. It's not possible. It is like saying that the Maasai of Namanga North and the Maasai of Namanga South are no longer related. It is just nonsensical. As I speak with you, there are Cameroonians in the east of, there are West Africans who travel to Cameroon, go through the east of Cameroon, go into Congo-Brazza, cross the water, go into DRC, do trading and return without documents. As we speak, there are West Africans who travel all the way from Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, up into Senegal, bring down textiles from there and from the Gambia, come down, they don't have documentation. I know the drivers who do it. I can give you the rates, I can give you the contacts, and it is standard. We all know ourselves. So this idea that we don't trade with one another and regionally, and we need to, no. The problem is what Ali Masri identified in 1968, state legitimacy, which takes you back to Berlin. The boundaries, the way Africans manipulate our borders tells you that our states have not yet achieved the level of legitimacy that will lead people to document their transactions. And our politicians have not sought to legitimize their political authority. And that is why we've got to make the connection from Berlin to where we are, because the consequences are such that when people tell you Africa's GDP is this, it's nonsense. But most of the money is not in the documented state. Most of the economic activity is not in the documented state. Regional integration is happening without the documented state. And just as a historical factoid, by the way, the rupee was the currency in East Africa until 1923. The Brits destroyed the rupee as the currency in the Indian Ocean zone of East Africa because the Indian traders were putting the Brits out of business, and the rupee became a block to the Brits being able to control the territory. And so all of this is weaponization of self-interest. What is our self-interest and how do we configure it? That is part of the question I hope we'll be dealing with in the next conversation. I yield.
Thank you so much to Gadara, Agnes, Chidi for sharing your thoughts with us, for making the time and even going past time. Of course, I will not end before because I also have a legal background, before saying that Fela Kuti also said in his song that 1894 law case is being used to judge a 1984 case in Africa, which I think just tells us about the absurdity of what we are living with as Africans, being the legacies of the Berlin Conference. But we have more discussions coming up. We have Twitter Spaces or X Spaces in February, last Thursday of February, and then a webinar, and then a space, and then a webinar like that. And so we'll have more targeted conversations. This was supposed to be an overarching and overview conversation of the legacies of the Berlin Conference. We will get into specific topics over the year, and we will invite you to continue contributing. Thank you so much once again for making time. Thank you to the organizers, to Kabarak. Please be on the lookout for the articles that will be published by African Arguments in February related to this topic. And I hope to see you next month.
Thanks so much. And yes, thanks, Patrick. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, guys.
You're the best.
Really enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.